last couple of weeks during our time together here, I've told you about how much I love the Christmas season. And as much as I have absolutely loved Christmas as a kid, as much as it meant so much to me, and I've gotten to share a couple of those memories with you, I think I may just love Christmas just a little bit more as a father. Getting to watch my kids during this time of the year is so much fun. I mean, they get so amped up and so excited and just so ready for everything, and it just kind of builds every day. They're kind of getting to the point now where they'll, not only look at the Christmas countdown on my phone like I told you a couple of weeks ago, but they'll actually go to our calendar that we have in our kitchen, and they'll sit there and they'll count how many more days until Christmas morning. They just love to get excited about all the different lights and all the things that we get to go see. We go out of our way to go do some of these stuff with them. It seems like about this time of year, their after-school snack switches from being crackers or whatever else we have around the house to candy canes exclusively. That's about all they ever want to have for their after-school snack. And it's just so much fun as their dad to sit there and watch them. And I'm so looking forward to Christmas morning because watching them open their presents and seeing that excitement cross their face is going to be a great time. They're out of here, right? Okay. We're going to give them clothes for the first time this year for Christmas. I'm kind of looking forward to that look of disappointment, too, if I'm not lying. So, it's going to be a good time. Maybe I'll snap a picture and show it to you later. But as much as I love our Christmases now, I got to be honest with you, I think my favorite thus far of having been a father was the Christmas of 2015. Let me explain why. Our daughters were born in the fall of 2012, in October, and so their first Christmas, they were infants. They obviously had no clue of what was going on around them. The next two Christmases, they were a little more aware. I mean, they really dug the tree, and they really liked breaking ornaments off of it. But they loved all that stuff of it, but they didn't really know. You know what I'm saying? Like, they didn't really grasp what was going on to it. But the Christmas of 2015, everything clicked. And they were more excited than I've ever seen them about anything ever. And as excited as both my children were, Adrian in particular, oh man, she couldn't wait to go and see the man who she had watched movie after movie about, who she'd seen decorations of, and that she'd heard different stories about. Adrian couldn't wait to go see the big man himself. She couldn't wait to go see Santa. In East Peoria, Illinois, which is pretty close to where we were living at the time, there was a Bass Pro Shop there. And we decided that was the best place to go take him to go see Santa for a few different reasons. First off, it wasn't too far away. Their whole decoration setup was just fantastic. I mean, they spared no expense on making it look like Christmas in that section. They had different crafts for the kids to play with, and if they got bored with that, there was a giant fish tank for them to watch while they're waiting for Santa Claus. But my personal favorite reason as to why we chose the Bass Pro Shop there is the picture with Santa is absolutely free. It's pretty great. So we get to the Bass Pro Shop, and we're standing in line, and Adrian's holding my hand. And there's this really large family in front of us as we're in line, and they're so large, in fact, that they're kind of blocking our view of Santa Claus. We can't even catch a glimpse of the guy. But they're all wearing like matching sweaters. And I didn't mean to eavesdrop at all, but I overheard them talking. Apparently, it was this family's tradition that every year they take a big family photo with Santa. Not a bad tradition, I thought. But it kind of stopped us from being able to see Santa Claus all the way up to, including when they went up there to go pose with the guy. Adrian just couldn't see him. And she was getting kind of frustrated, about as frustrated as any 3-year-old. And finally, after what felt like an eternity to my 3-year-old, the last one of them finally left the area, and she could see him. Her eyes got about 3 times bigger in her head than they normally are. She looked at me and said, "Daddy, is that him?" Why do I cry so often when I talk about my kids? Anyway, I looked at her and I said, "Yeah, baby, that's him." And she just went, "Whoa." And in a move that, as a dad, I'll always be eternally grateful for this man for doing, Santa Claus turned. He saw the excitement on my daughter's face, and he just subtly made this motion. That kid went so fast that I swear to you, she was like a cloud of dust like you see in a Scooby-Doo cartoon. She went as fast as those little legs would carry her to go all the way there, and in a absolutely perfect, fluid motion, Santa scooped her up, brought her around, and stuck her right on his lap. shortly joined by her sister. I mean, Robin was just as excited. Don't get me wrong. Robin was just excited, but Adrian was so caught up in the moment. She was around this guy that she had wanted to be around for weeks. And finally, she was here in this particular moment. It was so great because we were able to actually capture her excitement in that moment when we got this picture. She so lovingly looks at Santa Claus. She's so caught up in this moment. She's so joyful. Just to be in the presence of Santa meant the world to her that year. She was so excited, in fact, and so caught up in the moment, she almost forgot to tell him what she wanted for Christmas. And she talked about meeting Santa Claus for weeks afterwards, well after Christmas was over. This moment was awesome for her because this moment of being in the presence of Santa brought my daughter so much joy. It was something that was so significantly monumental for her. In fact, again, she talked about that well after Christmas, just this opportunity to be here with him. And all of us, we have those people in our lives, don't we? Those people who just being around them, just being in their presence, we don't have to say anything or do anything with them, just being around them, it gives us some semblance of joy. This moment where we get an opportunity to share with this person who for whatever reason, just something about their personality, something about the way that they carry themselves, it just makes us joyful. It's one of the things that makes this season so significant for us because we spend this time that's already a special time in our lives, and it becomes even more special as we spend it with those that we love and care about and those that bring joy into our lives. I'm willing to bet that for some of us in this room, we're looking way more forward to this Christmas than we have in a long time because we didn't get to see some of those folks last year. Because the COVID and coronavirus stuff, it just prevented us from being able to be around some of those people that fill our hearts with joy. And so this year feels like it's going to be even more special than in years past because we're finally going to be around them. Again, we have those people in our lives, but not only is it this notion that we get to be around these folks, we get to share in that joy that we have with each other. And that's one of the most significant parts about our joy. It's one thing to get joy from being in another person's presence, but there's something about those folks, isn't there, that you just want to share that joy with the people around you. I mean, if you think back to when you and your spouse were dating, right? You couldn't possibly wait any longer for them to come and meet your family, meet your friends, meet the people that are in your life because you wanted them to meet this wonderful and amazing and beautiful person who just brings your heart so much joy, maybe makes your heart skip a beat. You couldn't wait to be around them. Or if you have met a friend or made a particular friend over the last couple of weeks and who's just funny or just makes you happy to be around them, you can't wait for them to meet the rest of your friend group because you just know that they're going to hit it off famously, that your whole group is going to grow by one more person and it's going to be amazing. Or when your baby was born, you wanted to shout from the rooftops and invite the whole world to come and meet this new life that just fills your heart with absolute joy. Something about just being in the presence of these people. It brings us that joy, and we want to share it. We want to pass it on to those around us. And it's that notion of being able to share in joy, share in the joy of presence that is, I believe, at the center of our text today. We're going to be in Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 20. And kind of like last week, I'm jumping a little bit ahead. I mean, we're actually going a little bit past what we normally would this early into Christmas, but that's okay, I think. Because I think that this story has some weight to it that we need to understand. This is another one of those stories that you have heard 10 million times if you've heard it once. We become so familiar with it that we're almost unfazed by some of it anymore. It's another one of those pieces that's almost always represented in nearly every nativity scene that you ever see. We're going to be talking about Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 20. Go ahead and turn there in your Bibles or open up your apps to it. But understand that the night that Jesus is born, the night that God's presence is made present on earth for the very first time, heaven itself is so full of joy that it can't contain it. That the angels of heaven have to share in that joy with someone, anyone. But who they pick is a little unorthodox, at least by our standards. Now, when we get to this particular text, when we get to verse 8, again, you've probably read this story or been around this story so much that this doesn't even faze you. But all the way up to this, all the verses leading up to this are talking about the coming verse of Jesus. And in fact, if we look at the greater context of Luke itself, everything that Luke has talked about up to this point is pointing towards the birth of this guy Jesus. Everything that he's focused on is all about this particular thing. And so when we get to verse 8, which just in verse 7 is when Jesus is born, and in fact it ends with him being laying in the manger in that familiar scene that we all know of. When we get to verse 8, though, it feels like Luke takes a hard right turn out of absolutely nowhere. Verse 8 starts off, it says, "In the same region, shepherds were staying out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock at night." Now again, this is something that we're familiar with. We know this part of the text, but again, everything in Luke up to this point has been leading towards the birth of Jesus. Now Jesus has been born, and all of a sudden Luke decides to go and tell us about some shepherds. If you're watching a movie, like if you went home right now and you watched a movie about, I don't know, a superhero or just had some character in it that you knew was going to be the main focus. Let's say James Bond. You were going to go home and you're going to watch a James Bond film. This would be like the minute James Bond hits the scene, the minute you see him on your screen for the very first time in this movie and he says the infamous line, "Bond, James Bond." And that's pretty good for right off the bat, all right? But the moment he says that, all of a sudden the director makes a hard cut and we start talking about some construction workers. It's a little jarring, isn't it? I mean, don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with construction workers. They're the lifeblood of America. They do a lot of things and they're great people. However, we've been talking about this one character for so long, all of a sudden we're shifting to this group of guys who doesn't seem connected to the story. This feels so out of place, and yet we know this is no ordinary baby, and this certainly isn't going to be any ordinary night for these shepherds. Again, shepherds we talked about shepherds and shepherding, I don't know, there's like 52 sermons in a year, so maybe 30 times. We talked about shepherds a lot. So I'm not going to go in rehashing a bunch of stuff that we already know about shepherding at this particular time period. Suffice it to say that I'm going to remind you, by and large, shepherds were not exactly religious guys. Shepherding was the kind of career that attracted hard guys who were rough around the edges because it's a hard job. It's a very physically enduring job, and so you need guys who can handle that. It requires you to have weird sleep schedules and do all kinds of hard labor because, again, I'll remind you, sheep are dumb. They're dumb. I watched a sheep one time ram itself headfirst into a barn 3 times. Then I stopped it before it went for the 4th. Sheep are dumb. So shepherds themselves tend to be really hard men. They're rough around the edges. They're not the type of guys that you run into at the temple on a regular basis. You might see them for some of the bigger holidays. They might make an appearance and sit in the back. But they're not exactly the guys that even if you run into them at the temple, you're going to go out of your way to welcome them or to be around them. Their language is a little more coarse. Their smell is a little sheepish, which is not good. They're not the kind of guys that you're going to spend a lot of time around them. They're not the guys that you expect to talk much about faith or to care much about faith or to have a lot of things to say about God. And so their reaction when we get to verse 9 makes a lot of sense given what we know about shepherds and shepherding in this time period. In verse 9 it says, "Then an angel of the Lord stood before them." Yeah, because that happens every day, right? "And the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified." I mean, yeah. Wouldn't you be? Everywhere else in Scripture, you expect angels to come around to people who are priests and prophets and overly religious and people who are about to do something incredible or give birth to somebody who's going to do something incredible. We don't expect to find an angel show up and talk with shepherds. And even when those angels do go around to those people who it makes sense for an angel to come and talk to, their reaction across the board is the same. They're afraid. Right? I'm willing to bet that right now, if just all of a sudden, poof, right next to me, a real shiny dude just appeared out of nowhere, we're all going to get a little nervous. I'll especially get nervous because I'm closest to him. You get to see your pastor fall over. I don't know where we came from here. But anyway, so when an angel appears to anybody, even the people that we expect an angel to come to, it is a jarring experience. And for these shepherds who are not overly religious, to have an angel come and stand among them, they respond the only way that they can. They're scared out of their minds. And the angel starts off by telling them the same thing that we see almost every angel narrative that we have in Scripture. He says, don't be afraid. Yeah, because this happens every day, right? This is an unusual occurrence. The angel went on ahead and told these guys that he had the best news ever for them. And in fact, this news was so great, it was going to be good news for everyone. For the entire world. That is some good news. He goes and tells them that today in Bethlehem, which is just down the hill from these guys, it's just not that far of a journey for them to be able to go in Bethlehem. He says the Messiah, the Savior, the Son of God has been born. Now again, these guys are probably on the outskirts of religion, but they know about the Messiah. It's part of their cultural fabric. They know that Messiah has been promised since all the way back to the fall of man. And for thousands of years, people have been waiting for this Messiah. Long since these men were born, people have been waiting and pining and praying and seeking out Messiah. And now they get to find out he's been born. These guys, these common, ordinary, everyday shepherds are being told the greatest news anyone had ever heard up to that point. That's an incredible moment. This moment has to be almost too much for them. Like, think about this for a second. Try to place yourself in their shoes. This is not an everyday thing that should happen for them, and yet these shepherds are the ones who get to hear. It wasn't announced to the king. It wasn't proclaimed to the entire nation of Israel. Instead, this angel told a bunch of dudes sitting on a hill, watching some sheep. And if that wasn't enough, if that particular moment wasn't enough, after this angel tells them this incredibly awesome news, these simple shepherds, they get to see something that had to blow their minds. Because it's jarring enough when one angel shows up. But all of a sudden, after this angel tells them, hey, you can go to Bethlehem, you can find this baby wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger, all of a sudden, Luke describes that a multitude of angels appears. That's a unique word, multitude. It's an interesting choice of words for Luke to make here. It means that there were so many angels just showed up in that particular moment that there was no possible way he could count them. There's no markers that they could give to give you any idea of exactly how many angels were there. There were so many, it cannot be counted. The term multitude means a mass. That is a lot of angels. And these angels aren't just standing around. Instead, they're glorifying, they're praising God. They're saying, glory to God in the highest heaven, peace on earth to people he favors. They're not just excited. They're not just happy about this moment. These angels are joyful. Their joy has spilled out to the point they've seen all the prep work that God has laid out for this moment. They know how much time and effort and energy God has put into this particular plan so that mankind could be redeemed. And now, finally, after all this time, the plan is being started. These angels know better than you and I ever will until we're on that side how significant and how monumental and how joyous it is to be in the presence of God. And they know how significant it is that now the presence of God is present on earth. And the joy that they feel overflows. It spills out to the point that they have to let these shepherds know about it. That's an amazing moment. And in an instant, they're gone. The shepherds have the reaction that we'd probably expect out of them. Well, I mean, what do you do when you hear this particular news? What do you do when thousands upon thousands to possibly even millions of angels just show up and all start singing the praises of God, and they tell you it's all because some baby has been born. The end of verse 15 tells us exactly what they do. It says, they say to one another, let's go straight to Bethlehem and see what has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. They have seen the joy of heaven spilling out in front of them, and they have been invited to go and find the thing that's caused this much joy. They've been given pinpoint directions on how to get there and exactly what to look for. And so they got to go see it. I love the way that Luke puts it at the beginning of verse 16, and how he puts the way that they are running towards it. It says they hurried off. That you get this picture of these full-grown men just dropping their staffs or whatever else they got around them, and they are just booking it hard down that side of that hill, running just as quick as they can because they got to see this thing that the angels have told. And finally, after they make their way down the hill and they get into Bethlehem and they find him. They're standing there, and Mary and Joseph have just been jarred. I mean, a bunch of shepherds who are now just completely out of breath have just barged into this area. And they're telling him this crazy story about these angels that just showed up and told them about their baby, and about how their baby was the Messiah, and about how their baby was going to change everything, and they had to come and see it. They had to come and stand in the presence of God, now present on earth. And we know their reaction. We know how much that meant to them. We know how significant it was, because when they left, when they finally decided, hey, we got to get back to our sheep, we don't want to go. We want to be in this presence forever. But we have to go. Verse 20 tells us exactly the reaction of these non-religious shepherds, these guys who probably didn't spend a lot of time in the temple. Verse 20 tells us exactly how they responded. It says these shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had seen and heard, which were just as they had been told. They had seen a glimpse of heaven, of seeing the party that had bust out of the joy that the presence of God was now present on earth, and they had gone and found that baby. And for a few moments they had stood in the presence of him. The joy that the angels had experienced, the shepherds got to share in. And they were so moved by just being in the presence of God that, again, these guys who are not religious, these guys who do not spend a lot of time praying and worshiping God, they come back to it praising. Their hearts are worshipful. They're full of joy. You got to think this is a moment that they remember for the rest of their lives. They tell their kids about it. They tell their grandkids about it. They tell random strangers on the street about it. They tell the cashier at Target about it. Because they can't believe that they got to be in the presence of God, now present on earth. We often feel joy when it comes to this particular season. It's one of the things that we associate most with the Christmas season, is just a joy that we feel. That joy comes in a lot of different ways. It comes from celebrating the birth of Jesus. Absolutely it does. Of knowing that the presence of God was present on earth for just a moment. I think that's one of the reasons why we make such a big deal about Christmas. It's because it was the first time since the garden the presence of God had been with man. And that was the night that it was ushered in. And just that thought that God loved us so much that he put on flesh, that he came amongst us, naturally fills our hearts with joy. As Christians, as the followers of Jesus, we know what it means. We can have that joy all throughout the year, that it comes when we seek out and we try to enter into the presence of God, whether that be here at church, whether that be at home when we're praying, whether that be anywhere in the world, where for just a moment we take some time and try to usher ourselves into his presence. And yet, I don't know about you, but sometimes for me, this particular season gets so crazy busy, so insane with all the things that come with celebrating Christmas, that come with celebrating the presence of God, that sometimes I forget that I still need to make time to be in the presence of God. I get so amped up with the planning and the preparation. I mean, right now, my mind is immediately thinking about Christmas Eve service. I don't know if you know this, it's kind of a big deal for me. But that's where I'm at. And so I forget that in all this time to celebrate the presence of God, I sometimes forget to spend time in the presence of God. I'm willing to bet I'm not the only one. I'm willing to bet I'm not the only one of us in here that forgets to have that joy in this season because I'm far too busy doing other things. Folks, let me remind you, you need that time. You need that time to go and spend in the presence of God. To let your hearts be filled with the joy that truly come in this time of the season. To know that the presence of God was not just present that night, but is present with us today. But more than that, folks, or just as much as that, one of the most important things about joy, one of the most important things that come from the joy that we feel, one of the ways that we can actually magnify our joy, to make the joy that we already experience, make it even bigger, is when we share in that joy. Is when we invite others to come and partake and to come and see and to come be a part of this. That our joy from the presence of God is so full in our hearts that it begins to overflow and we have to tell somebody about it. So that hopefully they can come and stand in His presence as well and that their hearts can experience that same joy. I don't know about you. I've experienced it a couple times in my life, not as much as I wish I could say I have. But those times when I've been able to share the joy that comes from the presence of God with those around me, and that they come, and that they get filled up with that joy begins overflowing for them, man, it makes me, when my heart already feels like it's going to explode from joy, I feel like I know it's going to explode from joy. When we share our joy with the people around us, it makes ours even greater. It's important for us, not just at Christmas, but throughout every single day of our lives, to fill our hearts with the joy that only comes from His presence to the point that it overflows and we have to tell someone. We have to invite them into it in the hopes that it will become their joy as well. Today, we light the candle of joy. This candle serves as a reminder of the joy that we experience when it comes from God. The joy that we experience coming from His presence and His time. But it should also serve as a reminder of our need to share that joy.